So our next speaker is James Boyden. He is just about to finish his PhD here at CDU. Yes?
Yes.
Very, very close to submitting. And he also works full-time at ERISS, which is the Environmental Research Institute of the Supervising Scientist. So federal government out near the airport, they do a range of different environmental type things. And he's going to talk today about mostly PhD work, but it does sort of cross over some respects to some of the work he does at ERISS as well.
Okay, yeah, well, a bit of a long title there, but basically within Kakadu National Park, invasive weeds are a serious problem for conservation management and also the protection of natural heritage and cultural heritage and livelihoods. So the weed of interest which I monitored for over many years, including the time I researched it, basically paragrass is a perennial grass which basically snuffs out large areas of wetland habitat, and it reproduces by vegetative growth. So it's a fairly you can get interesting patterns when you use remote sensing to map it. So my aim of applying remote sensing obviously was to understand the distribution dynamics of paragrass to assist in the management of the weed. There was 5 objectives of my study. Basically, firstly, to map paragrass and native vegetation over a 10-year time frame, and using both Landsat and high-resolution imagery, and also map wetland habitats and fire regimes and interrelate the vegetation distribution data with my habitat data, if you like. So with that, I did a spatial vulnerability assessment of paragrass in relation to these habitats and with native vegetation. And I also looked at interannual changes in those habitats using high-resolution imagery. So my study site I had 2 study sites. One within the Magilla Creek floodplain, so the larger study area was the floodplain, and it's a 225 square kilometre area. And then I had a smaller area here which sort of encompassed an area where some work had already been done on the largest infestation of paragrass in the area. So with the Landsat imagery, which I used to map the whole floodplain, I actually used multi-temporal information. So with wetland vegetation habitats, they are very variable with the hydrological regime over the season. So using a composite of multi-temporal information, you get much better results with your classifications, because some vegetation is quite variable over those time frames, over one season, so an instantaneous snapshot will not capture what you want. Whereas paragrass is a perennial grass and a bit more persistent when you're mapping it over time. Anyway, so I use high resolution imagery. That's QuickBird and World View 2, which is sort of a spatial resolution ranging of between 0.5 metre and 4 metres with Iconis. So obviously you need ground data to validate your classifications, and there's different ways of collecting it on wetlands, which you're restrained in what you can actually do. And pretty much aerial photography is the best way to cover large areas, but to gather point information or as you're driving along on an airboat is quite useful. Image classification methods, you've probably seen diagrams like this before, but you collect field samples, image pre-processing, and you reserve a validation sample to validate your data, your classification data. So I used object-based image analysis using Ecology again, and this is the vegetation map I created with Landsat. Pretty much you get a much better accuracy with Landsat when you use the multi-temporal information to map vegetation. So paragraphs was mapped at 96% accuracy overall, and overall accuracy with all vegetation types in this 15 class classification was 84%. Higher resolution classifications, I used a machine learning algorithm again to map just binary classification, paragraphs or not paragraphs, using training data. And I got map accuracies ranging between 93 and 98% for 5 separate images from 2002 to 2010. With habitat mapping, I had a point data set from the floodplain representing depth, 250 points roughly, and 254 points of depth collected at roughly the same time. And I used this to correlate with the image data where I used moisture indices, wetness index, and to correlate. But I used 11 images in that, so that was a composite of the 11 images, and using the OBIA, object image analysis, to actually do a regression and come up with a depth map, if you like, a relative depth map of the floodplain. And then I looked at the fire regime, and was able to look at fire regime within in context of depth as well. So yeah, fire regime obviously declines, or the incidence of fire declines as you go into deeper water, obviously, because there's more water there and less likelihood of fire. But between years, the amount of fire on the floodplain dramatically varies, and with some years no fires occurring at all. So now I went on to the spatial vulnerability assessment, and paragraphs is correlated with depth habitat quite well, and you get this distribution pattern of roughly a normal distribution pattern which correlates with the depth regimes on the floodplain. So the red areas being 1.2 to 1.3 metres relative depth. And pretty much I've got 2.5 minutes, so I continued with looking at the spatial vulnerability assessment with vegetation as well, and the shared boundaries between different vegetation types like wild rice and native hymenacne correlate very strong. There's a very high incidence of paragraphs next to those areas. With the higher resolution data, I derived spatial indices to look at change over time, and I used a hexagon grid to derive those indices relating to either density and patch size and that sort of thing. So here's a sort of one of the maps, and I'm about to go through a sort of time series to look at the variability over that 10-year period, and you'll see that it's actually, just watch this, it's quite variable, but it's actually is increasing over that period. So in 2010, that's from 2002 to 2010. In 2010, it's really expanded out, but also hugging these particular areas along paleo channels and shallower areas. Why all that variability? Well, fire has a large part to play in that variability, and also depth. So this is just an analysis of variance I did between within the 3 different depth categories here that I've sort of taken out from that depth map, and basically looked at whether fire occurred in the previous year, and if fire occurred in the previous year, or if it didn't, the change in those habitats varies. So in the shallow depth habitat, if you had fire, obviously it declined, or it was near static, but it's in the late depth habitats, it deep water habitats, it was quite a different pattern. Now, within those three depth habitats, the amount of change that's happening over that time, you can see that actually this is your extant paragraphs. So from the instantaneous image, how much was mapped, and in the deep water habitat, it's going up higher. But in the cumulative spatial footprint of paragraphs, whether it's extant or extinct in terms of the classification at least, is going up much faster. So you're getting this in this moderate deep water habitat. And that's pretty much my talk. I could keep going, but that's... well, there's a number of ways on this particular floodplain. They're not actually managing paragraphs, but it's a good surrogate to look at landscape ecology of paragraphs. Now, by knowing where paragraphs is likely to invade which habitats and at what rate, you can basically focus your control efforts in those areas, but you also can focus your monitoring efforts in those areas. So, yeah, in wetlands where which haven't been invaded yet, there's a likelihood that we could start monitoring those using the higher resolution imagery to detect weed invasions in the first instance, but also to predict where they're going to occur.